December 22nd, 1944, 11:30 a.m., Bastogne, Belgium. The German officers stood waiting in the snow, supremely confident. They had delivered their ultimatum to a bewildered American MP at a forward outpost, and now they expected the formalities of surrender to proceed swiftly. Inside the besieged town, at the 101st Airborne Headquarters in the Heinz Barracks, Lieutenant Colonel Ned Moore handed the typed German message to Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe. McAuliffe read it once, then read it again, his expression unreadable. To the USA, commander of the encircled town of Bastogne. The fortune of war is changing. This time, the USA forces in and near Bastogne have been encircled by strong German armored units. More German armored units have crossed the river Our near Orthouville, have taken Marche, and reached Saint-Hubert by passing through Ypres-Cibret-Tillé. Libremont is in German hands. There is only one possibility to save the encircled USA troops from total annihilation. That is the honorable surrender of the encircled town. In order to think it over, a term of 2 hours will be granted beginning with the presentation of this note. If this proposal should be rejected, 1 German artillery corps and 6 heavy AA battalions are ready to annihilate the USA troops in and near Bastogne. The order for firing will be given immediately after this 2 hours term. All the serious civilian losses caused by this artillery fire would not correspond with the well-known American humanity. The German commander. The room fell silent. Staff officers waited for their commander's response. Outside, German artillery continued its methodical destruction of the town. Shells fell every few minutes, collapsing buildings, killing civilians, grinding away at American morale. McAuliffe looked up from the paper. His response was immediate and instinctive. "Aw, nuts!" He tossed the ultimatum onto his desk and walked toward the map table, already moving on to more important matters. Ammunition distribution, casualty reports, defensive positions. Colonel Harry Kennard, his operations officer, stopped him. "General, we need to send them a formal reply." McAuliffe turned back, genuinely puzzled. "What should I tell them?" Before we continue, click that subscribe button, like this video, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. It brings me great joy, knowing that these war stories and lessons get to people all over the world. Your support helps us bring more thrilling war stories, and trust me, you won't want to miss them. Now let's get back to the story. Someone in the room laughed nervously. "What you just said would be hard to beat, General." McAuliffe considered this for exactly 3 seconds. "Well, that's what we'll tell them then." The typed response was elegantly simple. To the German commander, nuts, the American commander. Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Harper, commanding the 327th Glider Infantry, was given the honor of delivering the reply. He walked to the forward outpost, where the 4 German officers still waited, their confidence beginning to waver as minutes ticked past. Harper handed over the paper. The German major read it, his face contorting in confusion. "What does this mean?" he asked in English. "Is the reply negative or affirmative?" Harper's smile was cold as the December air. "The reply is decidedly not affirmative." "Is it negative?" the German officer persisted. "If you don't understand what nuts means," Harper said slowly, "in plain English it means the same as go to hell. And I'll tell you something else. If you continue to attack, we will kill every goddamn German that tries to break into this city." The German officers departed in silence, their white flag no longer quite so confident. Back at headquarters, word of McAuliffe's response spread through the frozen foxholes and shattered buildings of Bastogne's perimeter. Men who had been rationing their last ammunition, soldiers whose feet were black with frostbite, medics working by candlelight in collapsing aid stations, they all heard the same message. Their commander had just told the Germans to go to hell. If McAuliffe wasn't surrendering, then neither were they. The Germans had expected capitulation. They received defiance. And in that single word, nuts, the psychology of the siege shifted irrevocably. The Americans weren't trapped in Bastogne. The Germans were stuck outside it. December 16, 1944. 5:30 a.m. The Ardennes Forest. The darkness erupted. 1,600 German artillery pieces fired as one, a coordinated barrage stretching 80 miles along the weakest section of the Allied line. The sound was beyond description. Men who survived it would spend the rest of their lives struggling to explain what it felt like when the earth itself seemed to scream. Private First Class Richard McKee of the 28th Infantry Division was asleep in his foxhole when the world ended. His diary entry, written 3 days later with shaking hands, captured what words barely could. Trees exploded into clouds of splinters. The ground heaved like ocean waves. Men simply vanished. Not killed, but erased. We'd been told the Germans were finished. We'd been told the war would be over by Christmas. The first minute of bombardment taught us we'd been living in a dream. The barrage lasted 90 minutes. Then came something worse: silence. Through the smoke and fog emerged the shapes that would haunt American nightmares. German armor, Tigers, Panthers, Mark IVs, assault guns. Accompanied by waves of Volksgrenadier infantry, they crashed through American positions that had been pulverized into moonscapes. Operation Wacht am Rhein had begun. Hitler had assembled this force in absolute secrecy. 410,000 troops, 1,400 tanks and assault guns, 12,600 artillery pieces. They had moved at night through dense forests, maintaining complete radio silence. Horse-drawn wagons moved supplies to avoid engine noise. No radio intercepts, no aerial reconnaissance had detected the buildup. The surprise was total, the devastation immediate. Along the Schnee-Eifel Ridge, 2 entire American regiments, the 422nd and 423rd Infantry, were encircled within hours. The 106th Infantry Division, which had arrived in this quiet sector only 5 days earlier, disintegrated under the onslaught. The 28th Infantry Division's line buckled and broke. Generalleutnant Fritz Bayerlein, commanding Panzerlehr Division, watched his tanks roll forward through the chaos. The Americans fought bravely in isolated pockets, but they had no idea what had hit them. We were through their lines before many of them had fired a shot. By nightfall on December 16th, German spearheads had penetrated 15 miles into American-held territory. Entire roads were clogged with retreating U.S. forces. Communication lines were cut. Command and control evaporated. Reports reaching Allied headquarters were contradictory, panicked, and incomplete. But the German plan had a critical requirement: speed. Their tanks needed fuel. Their troops needed supplies. And all of it had to flow through road networks that converged at one location: a small Belgian market town most Germans had never heard of. Bastogne. 7 major roads met there like spokes on a wheel. Without those roads, the German offensive would strangle on its own logistics before reaching its ultimate objective: the vital port of Antwerp, 125 miles northwest. General der Panzertruppen Heinrich Freiherr von Luttwitz commanded the 47th Panzer Corps tasked with seizing the crossroads. His orders were explicit: capture Bastogne within 48 hours. His force was overwhelming. The elite 2nd Panzer Division, the veteran Panzerlehr Division, the 26th Volksgrenadier Division, with 17,000 infantry. On paper, taking one small town defended by scattered American remnants should have been simple. But von Luttwitz faced a problem he didn't yet know about. Someone else was racing toward Bastogne just as desperately as he was. At 8:30 p.m. on December 17th, in Reims, France, the telephone rang at 101st Airborne Division headquarters. The Screaming Eagles had been resting after 72 brutal days in Holland. Men were playing cards, writing letters home, sleeping in actual beds for the first time in months. The voice on the phone was terse. Movement order, Bastogne, immediately. No winter clothing issued. No detailed briefing provided. No time for questions. Grab your weapons. Get on the trucks. Move now. 380 trucks began rolling north through freezing darkness, carrying 11,840 paratroopers toward a town they'd never seen. It was now a race. If the Germans reached Bastogne first, the roads would be theirs. The offensive would succeed. The war might be prolonged by months. If the Americans got there first, the entire German gamble would rest on breaking one surrounded town. December 17, 1944. 9:00 p.m. Reims to Bastogne. The temperature had dropped to 14 degrees when the first trucks carrying the 101st Airborne rolled out of Reims into the frozen darkness. 380 vehicles stretched in a convoy that seemed endless, headlights cutting through the night like a river of light flowing north toward disaster. Private Donald Bulge of the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment climbed into the back of a canvas-covered truck wearing the same uniform he'd worn in Holland. No winter coat, no thermal underwear, no cold-weather boots. Nobody had winter gear. There hadn't been time. "Grab your weapons," the officers had shouted. "Get on the trucks. Move now." No maps distributed, no detailed briefing given. Just a name whispered from man to man as they loaded up. Bastogne. Most had never heard of it. The convoy stretched for miles, winding through the Ardennes darkness like a steel serpent. Inside the trucks, paratroopers huddled together for warmth, their breath forming ice crystals on the canvas above them. Some tried to sleep. Most couldn't. The sound of distant artillery rumbled through the frozen air, a constant, ominous thunder that grew louder with each mile north. Then they started passing the retreating columns. American troops heading south. Hundreds of them. Thousands. Walking, riding in trucks, some limping, many without weapons. Their faces told stories the paratroopers didn't want to hear. Bulge would never forget what happened next. They shouted at us through the darkness. "Turn back! Turn back! You're driving into hell!" Some were crying. Others just stared at us like we were ghosts. One soldier grabbed my arm as our truck slowed at an intersection. His eyes were wide, hollow. "There's thousands of them," he said. "Tigers, panthers, everything. They'll slaughter you." I pushed his hand away. We kept driving north. The warnings came continuously. At every crossroads, every checkpoint, every place the convoy slowed. "Save yourselves! The Germans are everywhere! It's a massacre up there!" Staff Sergeant Bill Guarnere of Easy Company, 506th PIR, watched the retreating soldiers with growing anger. Some of these guys had thrown away their rifles, helmets gone, unit patches torn off. They looked beaten, destroyed. And they were telling us to run? We're paratroopers. We don't run. But the scenes were deeply unsettling. These weren't just scattered stragglers. These were organized units in full retreat. Tank crews without tanks. Artillery men without guns. Entire companies reduced to panicked fragments. At one intersection, the convoy stopped for nearly an hour, blocked by a massive traffic jam of retreating vehicles. Captain Richard Winters of Easy Company used the delay to gather what intelligence he could from the chaos. The reports were all bad. German armor everywhere. American lines shattered. Communications cut. Nobody knew what was happening. The offensive was huge. Maybe the biggest thing the Germans had launched since 1940. And the 101st was driving straight into the center of it. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Sink, commanding the 506th PIR, walked the length of his trucks during the delay, checking on his men. One young replacement, fresh from jump school, asked the question everyone was thinking. "Sir, what are we getting into?" Sink's answer was brutally honest. "I don't know, son, but whatever it is, we're the only thing standing between the Germans and a whole lot of trouble. The convoys started moving again at midnight. The warnings from retreating soldiers continued for hours, but the paratroopers kept driving north. At 11:30 p.m. on December 18th, the lead elements of the 501st Parachute Infantry Regiment rolled into Bastogne. The town was dark, confused, filled with retreating American units still flowing through. Colonel Julian Ewell, commanding the 501st, immediately began establishing defensive positions in the darkness. His men spread out into the frozen fields surrounding the town, digging foxholes in ground so hard it broke entrenching tools. They had beaten the main German force by less than 6 hours. The race was over. Now came the siege. December 20th, 1944, noon, Bastogne, Belgium. The last road closed with barely a whisper. German infantry from the 26th Volksgrenadier Division filtered through the forest south of Bastogne, cutting the final highway to Neufchâteau. Radio operator Corporal James Evans was monitoring the frequency when the report came through. "Road cut. We're surrounded." The trap had snapped shut. Inside the town, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe studied the situation map with growing concern. Red markers showing German positions now formed a complete circle around Bastogne. 18,000 Americans, the 101st Airborne, elements of the 10th Armored Division, artillery battalions, tank destroyer units, were now isolated in a shrinking perimeter roughly 16 square miles. No supplies could reach them. No reinforcements were coming. The nearest Allied forces were over 100 miles away, fighting their own desperate battles. Captain Richard Winters assembled his men from Easy Company in a frozen field on the perimeter. The briefing was grimly simple. "We're cut off. Nobody's coming to help us. We hold or we die." The paratroopers began digging deeper into the frozen earth. By nightfall on December 20th, the reality of the siege was settling in with brutal clarity. The division's supply situation was catastrophic. Artillery ammunition, rationed to 10 rounds per gun per day. Medical supplies, nearly exhausted. Morphine almost gone. Food, down to 1 meal per day, if you could call it that. Gasoline, tanks and vehicles immobilized for lack of fuel. And overhead, the sky remained sealed. Thick fog and low clouds grounding every Allied aircraft. No air support, no supply drops, no reconnaissance. The Americans were fighting blind and alone. In the town itself, Bastogne's 3,000 civilians huddled in stone cellars as German artillery methodically destroyed their homes. Shells fell every few minutes, collapsing walls, igniting fires, turning the market square into a landscape of rubble and frozen mud. Renée Lemaire, a 30-year-old Belgian nurse, worked 18-hour shifts in the aid station on Rue de Neufchâteau. The wounded kept coming, carried in on stretchers, dragged in by their comrades, crawling in on their own. She moved among them with quiet efficiency, doing what she could with dwindling supplies. There was never enough morphine, never enough bandages, never enough blood plasma. The cold became its own enemy. Along the perimeter, men dug foxholes in earth so frozen that entrenching tools shattered against it. They used helmets, bayonets, bare hands. The holes were never deep enough. When German artillery found them, shallow foxholes became shallow graves. Private First Class Kurt Vonnegut of the 423rd Infantry Regiment, captured earlier in the offensive, and now a POW being marched past Bastogne, would later write about what he saw. The cold was a living thing. It killed as efficiently as bullets. Men's feet turned black, their hands froze to their rifles. The wounded died not from their wounds but from exposure. Frostbite casualties began exceeding combat casualties. Medic Eugene Rowe of Easy Company moved through the frozen trenches, checking feet, looking for the telltale signs: white skin, numbness, loss of feeling. He knew what came next. gangrene, amputation, death. But there was nothing he could do. No dry socks, no way to warm the men, no way to evacuate the worst cases. "Keep moving," he told them. "Wiggle your toes, don't let them freeze." But how do you keep moving when you're stuck in a foxhole under artillery fire? The German attacks came in waves, probing assaults testing the perimeter, small unit actions trying to find weak points. Each one was repulsed, but each one cost ammunition the defenders couldn't replace. By December 21st, artillery commanders were making impossible calculations. 10 rounds per day per gun. Which targets were worth shooting at? Which German attacks could be endured without fire sup? Colonel Thomas Sherburne, commanding the division artillery, issued orders that would have been unthinkable a week earlier. Fire only at massed formations. Individual tanks, ignore them. Infantry attacks under company strength, small arms only. The siege was tightening, and above it all, the fog remained, thick, impenetrable, suffocating. No planes, no supplies, no hope of relief. Just cold, hunger, and the certain knowledge that German armor was gathering for something bigger. December 21st, 1944. Dawn. Bastogne perimeter. The fog came with the darkness and never left. Visibility dropped to less than 50 yards. Then 30. Then nothing. Just a white shroud that turned the battlefield into a blind maze where death came without warning. Men couldn't see their own foxholes 10 feet away. Artillery observers couldn't spot targets. Fighter bombers sat useless on distant runways, grounded by weather that seemed almost supernatural in its malevolence. The U.S. Army Meteorological Service report for December 21st was clinically understated. Conditions extremely adverse for all military operations. Ceiling 0. Visibility minimal. No improvement forecast. For the Germans, the fog was a gift from heaven. Oberstleutnant von Lauckert, commanding elements of the 2nd Panzer Division, noted in his log, "The weather is our greatest ally. Without their aircraft, the Americans are merely men with rifles. And we have tanks!" German armor began moving through the fog with terrifying freedom. Panthers emerged from the mist like prehistoric monsters, their engines rumbling, their guns searching for targets they could approach almost point-blank before being seen. American bazookas and tank destroyers could only engage at suicidally close range. Staff Sergeant Bill Guarnere, positioned in a foxhole on the northern perimeter, described the nightmare. "You'd hear them before you saw them, that deep growl of their engines. Then a shape would materialize out of the white. By then it was too late to run. You just pressed yourself into the frozen mud and prayed they'd roll past." The fog cut both ways, but the advantage went to the side with more armor. Inside Bastogne's aid stations, the conditions descended into something medieval. The main medical facility on Rue de Neufchâteau operated by candlelight and failing generators. Surgeon Major John Pryor performed amputations on a kitchen table while German shells exploded close enough to shake instruments from his hands. The building had no heat. Plasma froze in its containers. Blood donors had to be rotated constantly because men were too cold to give blood safely. Renée Lemaire moved through the packed rooms like a ghost, her white nurse's uniform stained with blood that wouldn't wash out in water cold enough to freeze. She held dying men's hands. She whispered comfort in French, English, whatever they needed to hear. She worked through exhaustion into something beyond exhaustion. The wounded kept arriving. Medic Eugene Rowe worked the perimeter aid stations, moving between frozen foxholes with supplies that diminished by the hour. Morphine was gone. He used what little remained only for the worst cases. Men screaming with shattered bones, soldiers with abdominal wounds who had hours left at most. For everyone else, bite down on this, it'll be over soon. But the cold was often worse than the wounds. Bodies froze in their foxholes before medics could reach them. Men died not from German bullets, but from exposure. their core temperatures dropping until their hearts simply stopped. When recovery teams finally retrieved them, the corpses were frozen solid, impossible to move, impossible to bury. Graves. Registration personnel stacked bodies in an abandoned chapel. There was no choice. The ground was too frozen to dig, the bodies too numerous. The living needed attention more than the dead needed burial. Private First Class Donald Burgett recorded the grim reality. We stacked our dead like cordwood. We covered them with tarps. We promised we'd bury them properly when this was over. If any of us survived to keep that promise. The cold killed slowly but efficiently. Frostbite cases overwhelmed the medical staff. Men's feet turned white, then purple, then black. Fingers froze to rifle triggers. Eyelids froze shut during guard duty. Captain Winters ordered hourly foot checks for his company. I don't care if you're under fire. Check your feet. Wiggle your toes. Report numbness immediately. But there was nowhere warm to send them. The German artillery continued its methodical work. Shells fell every 10 minutes, precisely timed to prevent any sense of safety, any moment of rest. Buildings collapsed. Fires burned. The civilian population pressed deeper into their cellars, praying. And overhead the fog remained, thick, suffocating, killing. No planes, no supplies, no visibility, no mercy. Just the certainty that somewhere in that white void, German armor was gathering for the killing blow. December 19, 1944, 10:30 a.m. Verdun, France. The emergency meeting convened in a cold, damp barracks that still bore scars from the First World War. Supreme Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower sat grim-faced at the head of the table, surrounded by his top commanders. The news from the Ardennes was catastrophic. An entire front collapsing. German panzers driving deep into Allied territory. Chaos spreading faster than information. The mood was funeral. General Omar Bradley spoke first. His voice tight with stress. We need to hold Bastogne. If that crossroads falls, the Germans can push all the way to the Meuse. British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery suggested pulling back, consolidating, forming a new defensive line. We need time to assess the situation properly. Eisenhower shook his head. We don't have time, and we don't retreat. He turned to the one man who hadn't yet spoken. George, how long would it take you to pull out of the Saar, move north, and counterattack? Every eye in the room turned to General George S. Patton. Patton didn't hesitate. His answer came instant and confident. I can attack with 3 divisions in 48 hours. The room erupted. Laughter, disbelief, accusations of grandstanding. Even Eisenhower smiled, thinking it was vintage Patton bravado. Outrageous, impossible, meant to boost morale in a desperate moment. But Patton wasn't smiling. George, Bradley said carefully, you're talking about disengaging from active operations, pivoting 90 degrees through winter conditions, and attacking north. That's over 250,000 men, thousands of vehicles, moving through snow and ice. You're saying you can do that in 2 days? I'm not saying I can do it, Patton replied coldly. I'm saying I will do it. In 48 hours, 3 divisions. In 72 hours, 6 divisions, if you need them. The skepticism was palpable. Turning an entire army in winter was a logistical nightmare that should take weeks, not days. Moving that many men, that much equipment, coordinating supply lines, establishing new communications. It was theoretically possible, but practically insane. Montgomery scoffed openly. That's quite impossible, George. You're being theatrical. Patton's jaw tightened. I'm being prepared. Then he explained what no one else in the room knew. He had already planned for this exact scenario. While other commanders had been focused on pushing east into Germany, Patton had been quietly wargaming contingencies. What if the Germans counterattacked? What if they broke through in the north? What if they struck through the Ardennes? His staff had developed 3 complete operational plans, each one mapping a different axis of advance northward. Detailed route assignments, supply dump locations, communications protocols, units designated, commanders briefed. Everything ready, just waiting for the order. "I've got the 4th Armored Division ready to move," Patton continued. "The 26th and 80th Infantry Divisions can follow. The plans are already written. The orders are already drafted. I just need your permission to execute." The room fell silent. Eisenhower studied Patton's face, looking for the bluster, the showmanship, the theatrical bravado that usually accompanied his boldest statements. He saw none of it. Patton was dead serious. "You really think you can do this?" "I know I can do this," Patton replied. "I've been preparing for it since we crossed the Rhine." Eisenhower made his decision in seconds. "Do it. Get to Bastogne. Break that siege." Patton stood immediately. "I'm leaving now. My staff is already moving the command post north." He paused at the door, unable to resist one final line. "We shall be in Bastogne before Christmas." As Patton strode out, Montgomery turned to Eisenhower. "He'll never make it. It's impossible." Bradley, who knew Patton better than anyone, had a different assessment. "If George says he can do it, he's probably already halfway there." He was right. By the time Patton reached his headquarters in Luxembourg, his staff had already begun executing the plans. Radio messages flew across command networks. Unit commanders opened sealed orders they'd been carrying for weeks. Supply convoys began reversing direction. Artillery batteries limbered up and started moving north. The Third Army was turning. 250,000 men, thousands of vehicles, hundreds of miles of convoy routes, all pivoting 90 degrees in the middle of winter, in the middle of a battle, executing a maneuver that military historians would later call one of the greatest logistical achievements in the history of warfare. And Patton had promised to do it in 48 hours. The impossible had just become operational. December 23, 1944. 3:00 a.m. Bastogne. The shell hit the aid station on Rue de Neufchâteau at precisely 3:47 a.m. One moment, René Lemaire was checking bandages on a soldier who'd lost his leg to a Panzerfaust. The next, the building disintegrated in a cascade of stone, timber, and fire. The explosion killed her instantly, along with 30 wounded men too badly injured to move, and a Belgian civilian volunteer whose name no one ever recorded. When medics dug through the rubble at dawn, they found René's body covering a wounded American paratrooper she'd been shielding. The soldier survived. She didn't. Major John Pryor, the chief surgeon who'd been operating in an adjacent room, stared at the collapsed section of building with hollow eyes. Then he turned back to his makeshift operating table and kept working. There were still wounded men who needed surgery. The dead would have to wait. The German bombardment had entered its 5th day, and it was becoming systematic, methodical, designed not just to kill, but to break morale. Shells arrived in predictable patterns now. Every 10 minutes during daylight, every 15 minutes at night, precisely timed to prevent sleep, prevent rest, prevent any psychological recovery. Bastogne was being erased from the map one building at a time. The town square was unrecognizable, a cratered wasteland of rubble and frozen mud. The church tower, which had stood for 3 centuries, was a shattered stump. Entire blocks had been flattened. Fires burned unchecked because there was no water pressure to fight them. And through it all, the civilians remained trapped in their cellars, praying in the darkness as their world collapsed above them. On the perimeter, the defenders were reaching their breaking point. Private First Class Donald Burgett hadn't eaten a full meal in 4 days. His rations consisted of 1 K ration per day, if supplies reached his position. Often they didn't. Men were sharing single cans of beans among 4 soldiers. Some were eating snow to fill their stomachs. The cold was relentless. Frostbite cases now outnumbered combat casualties 2-1. Men's feet were black and gangrenous inside their boots, but there was nowhere to evacuate them. Medic Eugene Rowe moved through the foxholes doing triage based on a brutal calculus. Can this man still hold a rifle? If yes, he stays. If no, he goes to the overcrowded aid stations where he'll probably die anyway. Ammunition was down to critical levels. Artillery batteries were firing less than 5 rounds per gun per day, only at the most threatening German formations. Machine gunners were rationing bursts. Riflemen were being told to fire only at targets they were certain to hit. Staff Sergeant Bill Guarneri's squad was down to 8 rounds of .30 caliber ammunition per man. When the Germans come, he told his men, let them get close, real close. Make every shot count. The exhaustion was perhaps worst of all. Men fell asleep standing up. Officers had to physically shake soldiers awake for guard duty. Some men simply stopped responding. Not dead, not wounded, just mentally checked out, staring into nothing. Captain Richard Winters walked his company's positions every night, checking on his men, knowing what he'd find. Hollow eyes, trembling hands, men who'd aged years in days. How you holding up, he'd ask. The answers were always variations of the same thing. Still here, sir. That was all that mattered. Still here, still holding, still fighting. The Germans attacked again at dawn on December 23rd, a major push from the southeast with infantry and armor. The 327th Glider Infantry took the brunt of it. For 3 hours, American soldiers fought from frozen foxholes with dwindling ammunition against waves of Volksgrenadiers backed by Panzer IVs. They held. Barely. When the German attack finally broke, the American line was intact but hanging by a thread. Bodies, German and American, lay frozen in the snow between the lines. There were too many to recover. Both sides left them where they fell. In his headquarters, General McAuliffe received the casualty reports with a face like stone. Then he walked outside and looked up at the overcast sky that had been their prison for a week. "We need those planes," he said to no one in particular. "God help us, we need those planes." The fog remained, thick, impenetrable, killing. But 130 miles south, Patton's tanks were coming. Racing through snow and ice, pushing north, getting closer. The question was simple. Would they arrive in time? December 23, 1944. 11:45 a.m., Bastogne. The change came without warning. Private Donald Burgett was huddled in his foxhole trying to conserve body heat when he noticed something impossible. A shadow. His own shadow cast on the frozen earth beside him. He looked up. The fog was breaking. All along the perimeter, men emerged from their holes, staring upward in disbelief as gaps appeared in the thick overcast that had imprisoned them for a week. The clouds were thinning, splitting apart, revealing patches of brilliant blue sky. "Aircraft!" someone shouted. "Ours!" The roar came from the southwest, a sound the defenders had been praying for since December 16th. C-47 transport planes, wave after wave of them, emerging from the breaking clouds like a vision from heaven. 241 aircraft in tight formation, their engines thundering across the frozen landscape. Men began cheering. Some were crying. Others just stood speechless, staring at the most beautiful sight they'd ever seen. Inside the lead aircraft, Lieutenant Colonel Joel Crouch checked his approach vector one final time. The mission had launched from England at dawn when meteorologists detected a narrow weather window opening over Belgium. The orders were simple. Get supplies to Bastogne or those men die. The drop zone was small, barely adequate for precision delivery. German anti-aircraft guns ringed the town. The margin for error was 0. 2 minutes, Crouch shouted to his crew. The C-47s descended to 1,000 feet, suicidally low by normal standards, but necessary for accuracy. German 88mm flak batteries opened fire immediately. Black puffs of shrapnel bloomed around the formation. One C-47 took a direct hit, its wing shearing off, the plane spiraling into the frozen countryside in a ball of flame. The others pressed on. Green light! Go! 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 The first bundles tumbled from the cargo doors. Ammunition, medical supplies, plasma, food, gasoline. Parachutes blossomed in red, white, and blue clusters, drifting down into the perimeter with near-perfect accuracy. On the ground, soldiers abandoned their positions and sprinted toward the drop zones. Captain Richard Winters had to physically restrain some of his men from running into German fire to retrieve supplies. "Wait for the all-clear," he shouted. "They're not going anywhere." But the men were desperate. They'd been starving, freezing, dying for lack of supplies. Now salvation was literally falling from the sky. The drop continued for 90 minutes. Wave after wave of C-47s braved German flak to deliver their cargo. Of 241 aircraft, 144 tons of supplies landed within American lines. A 95% accuracy rate that would be studied by military planners for decades. Ammunition crates landed in artillery positions. Plasma containers reached aid stations. Food bundles arrived at company command posts. Men who'd been rationing their last rounds suddenly had full magazines. Artillery batteries that had gone silent for lack of shells began firing again. The psychological impact was even greater than the material benefit. Medic Eugene Rowe watched paratroopers literally dancing around supply bundles, laughing, slapping each other's backs. Men who'd been hollow-eyed zombies hours earlier were suddenly animated, energized, hopeful. "We're not alone," one soldier said, tears streaming down his face. "They didn't forget us." In his headquarters, General McAuliffe read the note attached to one of the first bundles recovered. From Ike. "Hold on, Patton's coming. We're all coming." He allowed himself a rare smile. But the supply drop wasn't the only gift the clearing weather brought. Minutes after the last C-47 departed, a different sound filled the air. The high-pitched scream of fighter bombers. P-47 Thunderbolts dove from the clear blue sky, their rockets and bombs tearing into German positions that had operated with impunity for a week. Panzers that had stalked through the fog now burned in open fields. German artillery batteries that had tormented Bastogne were obliterated from above. Supply columns caught in the open were massacred. The tables had turned. The Germans, who'd praised the fog as their ally, now cursed the sky that betrayed them. Oberstleutnant von Laucher, whose Panthers had prowled through the mist unopposed, watched American aircraft destroy half his remaining armor in a single afternoon. His log entry was bitter. "The weather has changed. Our advantage is gone. The Americans fight like different men now." He was right. The defenders of Bastogne had just received more than supplies. They'd received hope, and Patton's tanks were getting closer. December 25, 1944. 5:45 a.m. Chaumont, south of Bastogne. Christmas morning arrived in darkness and bitter cold. Along the southern perimeter, the men of the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion waited in positions they'd occupied since midnight. Their M18 Hellcats, fast, lightly armored tank destroyers mounting powerful 76mm guns, were concealed behind stone walls, in tree lines, hull down behind frozen ridges. Captain James Leach had positioned his company with meticulous care. Intelligence indicated a major German armor thrust was coming at dawn. Reconnaissance had identified the force. 18 Panther tanks from the elite Panzerlehr Division, supported by Volksgrenadier infantry. The plan was simple, brutal, and required perfect timing. Let them come. Let them commit. Then kill them all. The first gray light of dawn was just touching the eastern horizon when Sergeant John Maccabee, positioned in an observation post, whispered into his radio, Contact. Multiple Panthers, moving up the road from Chaumont. Through the morning mist, the German column materialized. Massive Panthers rolling in formation. Their commanders confident, perhaps even cocky. They'd been told Bastogne was collapsing. The Americans starving and demoralized. This would be the breakthrough that split the perimeter. They were moving into a killing zone. Leach watched through his binoculars as the Panthers advanced past his first position. He needed them deeper, needed them committed, needed them trapped between his northern and southern elements with no room to maneuver. "Hold," he whispered into the radio. "Hold, hold." The Panthers kept coming, 18 of them now fully visible, their 75mm guns traversing, searching for targets. Infantry followed in their wake, gray-clad figures hunched against the cold, trusting the armor to shield them. Now! The ambush erupted from both flanks simultaneously. 6 Hellcats opened fire from the north, 5 from the south. The first volley caught the Panthers completely exposed, their thinner side armor vulnerable to the Hellcats' 76mm guns at this range. The lead Panther exploded, its turret lifting off the hull in a gout of flame. The second took a round through the engine compartment and ground to a halt, smoke pouring from its vents. The third tried to traverse its gun, but was hit twice in rapid succession, both rounds penetrating. Chaos erupted in the German column. Panthers attempted to turn, to bring their heavier frontal armor to bear, but the narrow road and close terrain boxed them in. The Hellcats were firing from concealed positions, moving after each shot, using their superior speed and maneuverability. Target left, Panther at 200 yards. Maccabee's gunner, Corporal Thomas Shea, was firing with mechanical precision. Load, aim, fire. The 76mm gun recoiled, the breech opened, spent casings clanging on the floor. Load, aim, fire. The Panther took the round through its turret ring. The crew bailed out, running for cover. German infantry tried to support their armor but were caught in the open by machine gun fire from American positions. They went to ground, pinned, unable to help as their Panthers burned one by one. Lieutenant Edwin Leiper's Hellcat accounted for 3 kills in 4 minutes, a Panther from 150 yards, another at 200, a third that tried to retreat and was hit in the rear engine deck. The battle lasted 18 minutes. When the smoke cleared, all 18 Panthers were destroyed or disabled. Some burned, others sat crippled, their tracks blown off, their crews dead or fled. The road from Chaumont had become a graveyard of twisted steel and frozen bodies. American casualties: 2 Hellcats damaged, no crew fatalities. Captain Leach walked the battlefield as dawn fully broke, counting the kills, documenting positions. 18 confirmed. A complete annihilation of a German armored spearhead that was supposed to break Bastogne's southern perimeter. Back in the town, word of the Christmas ambush spread through the frozen foxholes like wildfire. 18 Panthers destroyed. Not damaged, not driven back. Destroyed. Staff Sergeant Bill Guarnere, hearing the news, allowed himself a cold smile. Merry Christmas to them. Hope they enjoyed the present we left under their tree. The psychological impact rippled through both armies. For the Germans, it was confirmation that the Americans weren't collapsing. They were fighting back, and fighting smart. The defenders had teeth. The siege wasn't going to end with a whimper. For the Americans, it was proof that they could still win engagements decisively, even while surrounded, even while starving. The Hellcats had just shown that American firepower, properly positioned and expertly commanded, could shred German armor. But the larger strategic picture was shifting in ways the men in Bastogne couldn't yet see. Patton's spearheads were now less than 10 miles away, smashing through German positions with the fury of an army that had traveled 130 miles in 3 days to reach this moment. The siege was about to break. December 26, 1944, 2:00 p.m. Assenois, 4 miles south of Bastogne. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams stood in the turret of his Sherman tank, studying the German positions blocking the final approach to Bastogne. His 37th Tank Battalion had been fighting north for 3 days, smashing through every German defensive line Patton's Third Army encountered. Now only 4 miles separated them from the encircled town. 4 miles, and an entire German blocking force determined to prevent the relief. Abrams had no patience for prolonged tactical maneuvers. His orders from Patton had been explicit. "Get to Bastogne, today." He reached for his radio. "All artillery units, this is Abrams. Fire mission. Coordinates follow. I want everything you've got on those positions. Everything." What followed was one of the most concentrated artillery barrages of the entire Battle of the Bulge. 2,340 rounds crashed into German positions in less than 30 minutes. The earth erupted in columns of fire and steel. Foxholes collapsed. Machine gun nests disintegrated. German soldiers who'd spent a week besieging Bastogne now huddled in their own holes, praying for it to end. Before the barrage lifted, Abrams was already moving. "All tanks, advance! Maximum speed! Don't stop for anything!" The 37th Tank Battalion roared forward. Shermans, half-tracks, infantry clinging to the sides of vehicles, a steel avalanche that smashed into German positions still reeling from the bombardment. They didn't pause to consolidate, didn't stop to clear buildings. They just kept moving, firing on the move, crushing obstacles, overwhelming resistance through sheer momentum and violence. Leading the charge was Cobra King, a Sherman commanded by Lieutenant Charles Bulge. His tank hit German positions at full speed. Machine guns blazing, the 75mm main gun firing point-blank into any target that presented itself. A Panzerfaust team rose from a foxhole. Cobra King's bow gunner cut them down. A German anti-tank gun fired from a barn, missed, and was obliterated by return fire. Volksgrenadiers attempted to block the road. The Shermans rolled over their positions without slowing. Bulge could see Bastogne now, the shattered church tower, smoke rising from 100 fires, and between him and the town, one final German strongpoint, a roadblock reinforced with a Panzer IV. He didn't hesitate. "Driver, straight through! Gunner, target that Panzer!" Cobra King accelerated. The 75mm gun spoke once. The Panzer IV's turret rang like a bell as the round penetrated. The German tank slewed sideways, disabled. Cobra King crashed through the roadblock, scattering debris, and suddenly they were through. Clear road ahead. No more Germans. Just the southern edge of Bastogne's perimeter, where American soldiers were emerging from foxholes, waving, shouting, some crying. At 4:50 p.m. on December 26, 1944, Lieutenant Charles Bulge's Sherman Cobra King rolled into Bastogne. The siege was over. The column behind Cobra King poured through the breach. Tanks, half-tracks, supply trucks, ambulances. Soldiers who'd been trapped for 7 days rushed forward to greet their rescuers. Men embraced, pounded each other's backs, shouted themselves hoarse. Abrams's tanks immediately established defensive positions, widening the corridor, securing the supply line. Within hours, convoys were flowing into Bastogne. Ammunition, food, medical supplies, reinforcements. General McAuliffe met Abrams at the command post. Neither man was given to theatrical gestures. They shook hands briefly. "Glad to see you," McAuliffe said simply. "We came as fast as we could," Abrams replied. Behind them, the transformation was already visible. Artillery that had been rationing 10 rounds per day was firing freely again. Medics were evacuating the worst frostbite cases. Hot food, actual hot food, was being distributed to soldiers who'd survived on scraps for a week. In his headquarters tent 130 miles south, George S. Patton received the radio transmission at 5:15 p.m. Contact established. Relief accomplished. Bastogne secured. He had promised Eisenhower he could do it in 48 hours. He'd done it in 72, pivoting an entire army through winter conditions, covering distances that military planners said were impossible, and smashing through German defenses that were supposed to be impenetrable. Patton's only comment was characteristic. What the hell took them so long? But the numbers told the real story. The Third Army had moved 250,000 men and thousands of vehicles over 130 miles of snow-covered roads. They'd fought through multiple German defensive lines. They'd arrived exactly when needed. The relief of Bastogne marked the beginning of the end for Germany's Ardennes offensive. With the crossroads secured, the roads remained in American hands. German supply lines strangled. The offensive momentum, Germany's last great gamble, collapsed. Inside Bastogne, soldiers who'd held for 7 days against overwhelming odds finally allowed themselves to believe they'd survived. Private Donald Burgett, sitting in his foxhole, eating his first hot meal in a week, looked at the American tanks now filling the roads and said what every defender was thinking: we held. We actually held. They had done more than hold. They had proven something the Germans never understood. American soldiers, when cornered, don't break. They fight harder. December 27, 1944. German lines east of Bastogne. The reality of failure set in gradually. Then all at once. Generalleutnant Fritz Bayerlein, commanding Panzerlehr Division, stood beside his disabled command vehicle and stared at the fuel gauge reading empty. Around him, dozens of German tanks and assault guns sat immobilized, not destroyed by American fire, but strangled by logistics. No fuel, no ammunition, no spare parts. His division's log entry was brutally honest. Operations ceased due to complete fuel exhaustion. Offensive capability, 0. The story was the same across the entire German front. The spearheads that had driven deep into Allied territory now sat frozen in place, their advance stalled not by American resistance, but by the mathematics of supply and distance. The roads they'd needed, the roads through Bastogne, had never fallen into German hands. Without those roads, every liter of fuel, every artillery shell, every replacement part had to travel circuitous routes through snow-choked secondary roads already clogged with retreating wounded and broken-down vehicles. The German supply chain had collapsed under its own weight. Oberst Rolf Mohnke, commanding the 1st SS Panzer Division, recorded the moment when reality became undeniable. December 26th. Fuel status, critical. Ammunition, 40% of requirement. Food, exhausted. Orders received to continue offensive. Orders impossible to execute. The offensive is finished. We know it. The Americans know it. Only Berlin refuses to accept reality. The morale impact was catastrophic. German soldiers who'd attacked with confidence on December 16th now huddled in frozen foxholes, watching American fighter bombers circle overhead with impunity. The Luftwaffe, promised to provide air cover, had been shot from the skies in numbers that amounted to organizational suicide. On December 23rd alone, when the weather cleared, the Luftwaffe lost over 300 aircraft trying to contest American air supremacy over the Ardennes. Inexperienced pilots flying outdated aircraft were massacred by veteran American fighter squadrons. By December 27th, the Luftwaffe's operational strength in the West had been effectively destroyed. German commanders stopped requesting air support. There was none to request. Lieutenant Hans Schmidt, a tank commander with the 2nd Panzer Division, captured the spreading despair in his diary. "We were told this offensive would win the war. We were told the Americans would collapse. We were told the weather would protect us. All lies. Now we sit in frozen fields, out of fuel, waiting for American tanks to finish us. The men no longer believe in victory. They only hope to survive. The German High Command ordered a final counterattack on December 30th, a desperate attempt to salvage something from the collapsing offensive. General der Panzertruppen, Hasso von Manteuffel, assembled what remained of his 5th Panzer Army for one last thrust toward Bastogne. It failed before it began. Units reported to assembly areas at half strength. Tanks arrived without fuel. Artillery batteries had no ammunition for preparatory barrages. The attack went forward anyway, out of bureaucratic momentum more than tactical sense. American forces, now reinforced and resupplied, repulsed the assault in hours. German casualties were severe. Gains were non-existent. Von Manteuffel's after-action report was devastatingly honest. The offensive is over. Further attacks serve no purpose except to waste lives we cannot replace. By January 3, 1945, Hitler finally authorized a general withdrawal from the Ardennes salient, what had begun as Germany's last great gamble. A surprise offensive meant to split the Allied armies and recapture Antwerp, ended in complete strategic failure. The Butcher's Bill told the story. German losses: 100,000 casualties, 800 tanks destroyed, 1,000 aircraft lost, irreplaceable fuel and ammunition expended. American losses: 89,000 casualties, but with replacement capacity, Germany couldn't match. More devastating than the numbers was what the Bulge revealed. Germany had thrown everything into this offensive: every reserve, every hidden tank battalion, every last liter of hoarded fuel, and failed to achieve any strategic objective. Bastogne had held. Patton had arrived. The Americans had bent, but not broken. And now, with German reserves exhausted and the Luftwaffe destroyed, nothing stood between Allied armies and the Rhine. Oberst Otto Riemer, reflecting on the offensive weeks later, spoke for an entire army. "We gambled everything. We lost everything. After the Ardennes, we knew the war was over. We just didn't know how long the dying would continue." The defenders of Bastogne had done more than survive a siege. They had broken Germany's last offensive, and with it, Germany's last hope. Bastogne, Belgium, December 16, 1994. 50th anniversary. The veterans gathered in the town square where half a century earlier, German shells had fallen every 10 minutes. Some walked with canes, others in wheelchairs. Many wore uniforms that no longer fit quite right, medals gleaming on their chests. American paratroopers, tank crews, medics, and among them, a smaller group wearing different uniforms. German veterans, former enemies. Men who'd fired at each other across frozen fields, now standing together in remembrance. Former Oberst Rolf Mohnke, who'd commanded elements of the 1st SS Panzer Division during the siege, stood before the assembled crowd. His voice carried the weight of decades. "We came to Bastogne certain of victory. We had more men, more tanks, better positions. We sent you an ultimatum demanding surrender because we believed, truly believed, that you had no choice but to accept." He paused, looking at the American veterans. "We were wrong about everything except one thing. The Americans were trapped. But we failed to understand what that would mean. We thought encirclement would break you. Instead, it revealed something we had not accounted for." Donald Burgett, now 70 years old but still carrying himself like a paratrooper, met Mohnke's eyes across the crowd. Mohnke continued, "We mocked you. We called you soft, inexperienced. We thought your resolve would collapse under pressure, under cold, under bombardment." His voice dropped. "We learned at terrible cost that we had fundamentally misjudged the American soldier. You didn't fight like men who were defeated. You fought like lions defending their last ground." The recognition came too late to change history, but it was sincere. Former General Lieutenant Fritz Bayerlein, whose Panzer Division had been part of the encircling force, spoke to a small group during the reception. After Bastogne, we stopped underestimating American forces. The reputation you earned in that frozen town preceded you for the rest of the war. When German commanders learned they were facing veterans of Bastogne, it changed their calculations. The lessons of Bastogne rippled far beyond that single battle. Military academies, American, British, German, studied the siege for decades afterward. Not just the tactics, but the intangibles. Morale under extreme conditions, the role of leadership in crisis, the power of defiance against overwhelming odds. The phrase nuts entered American military culture as shorthand for a specific kind of courage, the refusal to accept defeat when surrender seems rational. General Anthony McAuliffe, asked years later about his famous reply, was characteristically understated. "I just said what any American soldier would have said in that situation. We weren't quitting." But Bastogne became more than a military victory. It became a symbol, a proof point that American resolve, when truly tested, doesn't crumble. The town's name became synonymous with determination against impossible odds. The physical evidence of the battle remained. Foxholes preserved in frozen earth, Sherman tanks positioned as monuments. The Mardasan Memorial, a star-shaped structure bearing the names of 76,000 American casualties from the Battle of the Bulge. And in the town cemetery, a simple marker for Renée Lemaire, the Belgian nurse who died shielding a wounded American paratrooper. Both armies honor her memory, proof that heroism transcends uniforms. As the 50th anniversary ceremony concluded, Private First Class Kurt Vonnegut, by then a famous author, was asked what Bastogne meant to him. His answer was simple. It was the place where we learned that Americans, when cornered, don't surrender. We dig in deeper. We fight harder. We hold. Former Lieutenant Hans Schmidt, standing nearby, nodded in agreement. That's the lesson we learned, the one we never forgot. The veterans, American and German, shared a final moment of silence together. Former enemies, now old men, united by the shared experience of having survived something extraordinary. Bastogne had taught both armies something fundamental. Geography can encircle a position. Artillery can destroy buildings. Winter can freeze soldiers in their foxholes. But American resolve cannot be encircled. The 101st Airborne, the tank destroyers, the artillery crews, the medics, they had proven that American forces, properly led and properly motivated, would hold against any odds. It was a lesson the Germans learned at Bastogne. It was a lesson the world has remembered ever since. The siege ended in December 1944. The legacy endures forever.